Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I am really pleased to say that I am joined by Jack Brentnall to talk all things NFL draft. Jack is a NFL draft editor for UK-based website The Touchdown NFL. He also is a contributor for Lombardi Avenue by Fansided as well. Really pleased to have Jack on today, get a better insight into this year's draft for me and obviously for you guys as well. I have some specific questions and topics that I want to ask Jack about, and then basically just see where the conversation goes. But I promise I'll try my best to keep us somewhat on track. We're going to try and talk about the draft as a whole, top prospects, positional strengths and weaknesses, and of course the quarterbacks. One thing all Browns fans are very keen on. If we get time, we'll also do a little bit of Senior Bowl and just get Jack's thoughts on the Browns draft overall. But first and foremost, thank you so much for lending me your time, Jack. Thank you for coming onto the channel. How are you? How are you doing on this I say fine weekend. It's a bit of a miserable weekend weather-wise down here, but how are you?
Yeah, all good, mate. Thanks for having me on.
No worries.
Busy in the kind of pre-draft prep,
Yep.
but obviously looking forward to Super Bowl tomorrow, even if it's
Yep.
maybe not the most exciting of matchups.
No. You got any plans for it, or just watching at home, a chilled one, or?
Uh, I think I'll be out for most of the day, so it'll just depend how late I can stay up and whether I'll be awake in
Yeah.
early hours, but probably just at home.
Yeah, whether or not you want to stay up to watch the Eagles or the Chiefs, but I suppose.
It's one of those when it was coming in, and I was like, oh, like this is the most boring matchup for a neutral.
Oh, yeah.
You
I
know,
mean, I'm going
but
to watch it with a Chiefs fan, so I wonder how that's going to go. But
uh,
before we get into it, Jack, can you just give us a kind of introduction into how you got into doing NFL draft stuff? Because I think I get the question a lot: how am I an NFL fan?
mm.
So I think a lot of people would be wondering how a British, American football fan gets into doing scouting and draft stuff and all of that. So just a
Yeah,
quick kind of
sure. So it would have been the 2019 draft, I think it was. Somebody that I was working with was, um, they kind of shared me like their notes on prospects, and I was like, oh, I didn't know regular guys tend to do this. So then I
yeah,
just
yeah,
ended up diving into it for the next draft, which was the obviously the Joe Burrow
yep,
to Justin Herbert one. And then I've kind of stuck with it since. So I've been with the touchdown now. So I joined them last year after doing my own thing for a while. So did the draft guide with them last year. Have another one coming out this year. So it's kind of it takes up a lot of my time these days, but it's great fun and it's nice at this time of year when everyone else kind of gets into draft season because I've
yeah,
been kind of watching guys all year long. So
yeah.
it's nice to kind of start sharing these thoughts and these ideas and having these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, during the season, maybe people aren't, well, apart from maybe, the teams that are really bad from the get go, but not everyone's as interested in the draft all year
Yeah.
round like you are. So just a brilliant reference point for me to bring on here. So really appreciate you coming on. I will link all of Jack's, links to the touchdown wire and all of that stuff in the description. So check that out if you want to check out his great work. But I don't want to keep too much of your time today. So let's just get straight into it, I suppose.
Sure.
So, looking at the 2025 draft as a whole, I think partly due to the lack of perceived quarterback prospects at the top, it's kind of being viewed by the media as a weaker draft, somewhat of a less sexy draft, shall we say, which unfortunately seems to always be the case whenever the Browns are picking high in the draft. But I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this draft in its totality. Do you view it as a weak draft, as kind of the media are saying, and how would you kind of just best sum up the overall talent pool this year?
Yeah, I think it's been overstated. I don't think it's a strong class, but I think the reason it's been talked up as being so weak, I think, is just because some of those premium positions, there's maybe not the blue chip guys that we've been used to seeing. Obviously, quarterback seems to drive a lot of draft conversation every year, doesn't
Yeah,
it? And if it's a bad quarterback class, there's often a perception that the whole class is underwhelming. There are definitely some really talented players in this year's class, some of whom we'll talk about. Yeah, like I say, it's not the strongest, but I think it's been overstated how bad this group is, to be honest.
Yeah, and I mean, as I mentioned, I think as you said as well, I think just because when it's the quarterbacks aren't the top guys, the media they all love to talk about the quarterback, so they kind of struggle to find something else to talk about. That's why we have people like you, thankfully, to kind of shed light on the other positions in the NFL other than quarterback, because some people might not be aware, but there are other positions in the NFL. In regards to the ton of top prospects, then in this draft, what guys do you view kind of as the top of the crop this year? Let's maybe say 1 to 5. Given that the Browns have a top 5 pick, who
Yeah.
would you say those guys are?
So this is obviously just based off kind of prospect grading in terms of how good these guys are, not necessarily where I draft them.
Yep.
But my top ranked prospect is Travis Hunter, who is the wide receiver and cornerback
Yep.
from Colorado. Um, I think that if people aren't already familiar with Hunter's game, I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know about why he's so special. Two-way player in an era that we don't get two-way players anymore. He won the Heisman Trophy as the best player in college football this year. Finished with over 1,200 yards and 15 touchdowns as a receiver. On defense, he's got 4 picks, 7 pass breakups. Like he's a legitimate first round talent at 2 positions.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever seen. I don't know if we've ever seen that before. Certainly, like in my lifetime, there's been a couple of guys who've played both sides, but nobody who's been this good
Yeah.
at both sides. He's elite athlete, really intelligent. I think the football intelligence stands out. That kind of background playing both positions really kind of serves him well, both in terms of as a receiver, how he attacks coverage and how he attacks DBs, but also on defense in terms of how he reads routes, how he feels coverage. He's probably the best kind of zone coverage defender I've scouted. And he
Wow.
has like incredible hands that play really well through contact, even though he's like 185 pounds. So, obviously not the perfect prospect. You'd like him to be a little bit bigger than that, but I think he's as close to a slam dunk prospect as you've got in this class for me.
Yeah. So do you think, just quickly on Travis before you get onto the other,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
some of your other guys, do you see him as a better wide receiver or cornerback?
So I feel like I've kind of ummed and ahed over this one. For me, he's graded out better at corner.
Yep.
I think he is a rarer talent at corner, and I think that much I'm kind of confident saying. Whether I would want him at corner or receiver in the NFL, I'm kind of part of me's leaning more towards receiver. And that might sound strange, but I think it's partly because cornerback is such a volatile position year to year. You just have to look at how much cornerbacks get paid versus maybe like wide receiver or edge to see kind of how that plays out. It's very rare to see a guy be kind of top cornerback year after year after year. Um, with the way the league's going, maybe having him as a receiver is where I'd lean, but I'm kind of like just draft him and play him where you need him. If you've got a hole at cornerback, put him there. If you've got a
Yeah.
hole at receiver, put him there, and you'll be fine.
You see, for me as a Browns fan, of course, cornerback is arguably one of our least most important needs right now. But through this whole process, I think I've been in the camp of viewing him more as a corner. But I think what you say about kind of where the league is going, where of course the money is going to influence what he wants to do as well.
Sure.
I think I'm kind of just in the same boat as you in terms of just draft him and work it out essentially. Whether you play him on offense and maybe have a few sub packages on defense, or the other way round, I think he's, as you said, I think he's a slam dunk, regardless of who picks him for what position. But any other guys that you kind of see at the top of this draft?
So another defensive guy for me. Actually, I'll kind of spoil a little bit of my top five. 4 out of the 5 are defensive guys, if we count
Wow.
Hunter as a defensive guy.
Yep.
Is Mason Graham, the defensive tackle from Michigan. So, and again, this is one of those things where I think defensive tackle maybe isn't the most sexy position, so it maybe doesn't get as much kind of hype and love from fans. But this is a 2-time All-American. He was also a freshman All-American in his first season with Michigan. really great combo of size, burst, fluidity. He's used up and down the line at Michigan. Obviously, they've got Wink Martindale there as the defensive coordinator, or did have him last year, and he kind of used Graham all over the place, and he won kind of comfortably from a range of alignments. He's also a really good run defender. Um, he anchors really well. He can withstand double teams. So you've got a guy who can be a three down difference maker. His hand usage is great, and he can kind of, he can win in different ways. He can go through you, he can go round you. He's not the longest rusher, so like there is going to be a length question, and I'm interested to see how he kind of comes in at the combine and what he measures in at. But the talent is there, and he just feels like a guy you could put there on Sundays already, and he's just going to be a very, very safe prospect with pass rush upside. And I think, again, you look at the teams that are in the Super Bowl. You've got Philly and you've got Kansas City. Both of them have a really disruptive interior defensive lineman in terms of pass rush.
Yeah.
Having that, I think, is really important in the modern NFL, and
Yeah.
Graham gives you that.
Yeah. Yeah, Graham is one of my top three prospects. I am an Ohio State fan. It does pay me to, call a Michigan guy one of the best prospects in this draft. But as you said, kind of to have that good of a run stuffer, but with the upside potential as a pass rusher is so important in the NFL. As you said, the defensive tackle position doesn't kind of get the media kind of coverage that maybe the edge rushers do, or maybe some of the other sexier positions, but it's one of the most important positions on that defensive line. As you just alluded to, you look at Chris Jones and what Jalen Carter are doing. If you can get a similar player to either of those two, I think that's definitely worth one of the top picks in the draft. What's your thoughts on Abdul Carter?
He is on my list.
Yep.
So we can go to him. He'd probably be fourth on my top five at the moment. Not
Cool.
necessarily, like I say, this is not ranking in terms of where I'd take them, just in
Yep.
terms of how I've got them graded. Obviously, yeah, this is Edge from Penn State, former off-ball linebacker, transitioned to Edge this year. I don't know if I've ever seen a guy change position and look this much at home, like so quickly. He was straight away an impact player at Edge. Now, you'll hear a lot of Micah Parsons comps, and I think that's partly because they both play for Penn State, partly because they're both elite athletes, and to be honest, because they both wear number 11. But like there is something to that. I think Carter's got the high-level athletic traits you need to win as an edge in the NFL. He's really fluid. You can see that kind of off-ball linebacker background, I think, when he kind of bends or if he's crossing the face of the offensive tackle. They'll drop him into coverage occasionally, and he's like obviously very comfortable with that because he's got that background already. His wide range of pass rush moves is what really stood out to me, though. Like, you think, okay, you've converted to edge this season, you're expecting it to maybe be more of a kind of pure athlete, just trying to win with traits rather than, finesse, rather than technique, rather. But he's actually quite a good technician. And he's got a physical play style. He doesn't always play, he's not always the strongest, and I think you'd hope he adds a little bit more kind of sand in his pants to stop the run. There's definitely room to develop as a run defender. He plays a little bit narrow. He can get kind of knocked off the ball a bit. But to be honest, like, if it's your first season playing edge and with your hand in the dirt, like, that's fine. You can work around that. He'll get stronger when he's in the league. I think there's just not many guys who can move like that and can rush the passer like that. So, yeah, surefire kind of top end of the first round pick for me.
Yeah, he's been my favourite prospect, kind of in my dive from this. Obviously, before the Myles Garrett trade request came out, it was still, the guy that I was leaning towards if he was there at number 2, purely just because of the excitement of pairing him with a Myles Garrett. As you said, I just think he's so explosive. He's so quick off the line. He's one of the best athletes in this draft, regardless of position, in my opinion. And of course, this year as a full-time edge was just incredible, really. 12 sacks, 24 tackles for loss, which I believe led all players in the FBS this year, and is a number that not even Miles Garrett or either of the Bosa brothers managed to get in college. So for me, he's kind of been the guy I've had my eyes set on from the start. But of course, with the Miles Garrett news, maybe that it just increases even more the need for me. So that's kind of why I was interested on how you view Carter. I think Daniel Jeremiah's got him as his number one prospect. I think a couple guys have. So interesting to see you have him at 4. Did you say so? Who did you have at 3?
So who I have at 3, and this is going to come with a very large caveat,
Yeah,
is Ashton Genty, the running
yeah,
back from Boise State. Now,
yeah,
I'm not taking this guy at number 3.
yeah,
Um, I'm probably not taking him top 10 just because running back value. But like as a player, if you're just grading them in terms of how well they play their position, like Genty is absolutely outrageously talented. He is such a fun watch. He looks like if you ever kind of go back and watch some of these top guys playing high school football and they just
yeah,
kind of run over guys and they just bounce off tackles. There
yeah,
are times when you're watching Ashton Genty and it's kind of like you're watching some guy in high school, just who's just better than everybody else. And yes, he's at Boise State, and yes, he wasn't always playing top level competition, but when he did play top level competition, he looked good.
yeah,
Just go and watch the game he had against Oregon this year. He was like absolutely unstoppable. He reminds me a lot of Alvin Kamara. Now, Alvin Kamara gets people get comped to Alvin Kamara a lot, and I think it's often overused. But he actually does. Like they have the similar kind of build, but he's also got that outrageous kind of contact balance that Kamara has. The stat that really sticks out for me is he had 151 rather missed tackles last year. So for context, the next most since this stat's been tracked over the last decade is Bijan Robinson with 104. The gap between Genty at 1 and Bijan at 2 is as big as Bijan and the guy at 153.
wow,
Like it's now he did have a ton of carries, but regardless, like that's still just insane. He's got great vision. He's got really good lateral agility and athleticism, and he can handle a heavy workload. I can't remember how many carries he ended up with, but I think he led the FBS
yeah,
in I think it was well over 300 carries this year. So there is going to be a bit of concern about kind of tread on the tires. He's had more than 800 touches in the last 3 years, so it's quite a lot of work at the college level. And he does have a fumbling issue. Like it's hard to find holes in Genty's game. I think he's had like 10 fumbles over the last 2 or 3 years. I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but he's had quite a lot of fumbles.
yeah,
But I mean, you can't teach guys what he has, and you know he is up there with the kind of Bijan level prospects as far as I'm concerned in terms of running backs. Now, how high you take him is going to be the big conversation, because he's a running back, right? And
yeah,
but on pure talent, you've got to shout out Genty as one of the best in the class.
yeah. Do you? I've seen some concerns about size, which I don't quite understand. I mean, I know he's a little bit maybe on the height side, but I think he's 210 pounds at least. Is there any weight to that at all, or do you think?
I don't I don't get it. I don't really see it. Yeah, he's short, but there's plenty. I think he's 5'9", but there's plenty of precedent of those smaller guys. Like for me, if you're short is fine as long
Yeah,
as you've got the kind of play strength, and he definitely does. Now, don't get me wrong, he's not necessarily the hammer you're going to use all the time in short yardage.
yeah,
He can do it, but like he's more than big enough. Like there's plenty of guys that size. You look at like Kamara, Aaron Jones. They're kind of
yep,
similar size, and those guys have carved out really good NFL careers. So I'm comfortable. I don't think a guy needs to. Running backs don't all need to be Derrick Henry size to be.
Is that? I think that's the issue, isn't it? Is that everyone
Yeah,
looks at Derrick Henry and thinks and kind of forgets that that is a unicorn.
yeah,
But
exactly.
But
Yeah,
Derrick Henry's another player as well that had a lot of carries in high school and college and in the NFL as well, and it hasn't seemed to slow him down up until
yeah,
this point. I think that was the biggest knock that I saw on social media about Gene Cheese. Everyone was, oh, well, yeah, of course he's going to run for that many yards when he's got that many carries. And you think it's 7 yards a carry. I don't care how many carries it is. When you're knocking out consistently 7 yards a carry, I don't care if you ran the ball 1,000 times that year. That is very
Yeah.
impressive for me.
And actually, to be honest, in a way, maintaining that efficiency at that volume is even more impressive. Like averaging 7 yards a carry, if you're getting kind of 10 carries a game, that's that's
Yeah,
fine. But when you're getting this workload, and defenses are stacking the box, like Boise State's offense was Ashton Genty.
yeah,
Like defenses were doing everything they could. They had like one job, and they
yeah.
couldn't stop him. So like it's yeah, one of the craziest seasons I've ever seen.
I mean, again, not to, but back to Derrick Henry. He was getting all of those carries, but that he was at Alabama. They had those players on the outside as well that they had to account for. Yeah, I think it was a lot of kind of just people trying to not make as much out of it as they could. But it was an historic season from Ashton Ginchi and something that should definitely improve his draft stock, even though he is a running back. Would love to see him go top 12 and get a pretty decent rookie contract in terms of money to start his career, because he's definitely deserved it based on what he's done at college up until this point. So who's your fifth guy to round off your top five?
So this might be a little more rogue. I don't know how many top fives he'll be in. He's certainly probably a consensus first rounder, but it's Georgia safety Malachi Starks. Um, Now, again, it's kind of like the Genty conversation. I'm not taking a safety top five.
Yeah,
But as a player, I think he's phenomenal. You look at him, he is really excellent athlete. He's got that kind of, when you're looking at safety, or at least for me, when I'm scouting safeties, there's a few things I'm kind of really keen to see. It's the kind of transitional athletic ability. You've got to be playing on the back end. You've got to have those smooth hips. You've got to be able to turn and run. And you've got to be smart and be able to read plays from deep. The further you get from the ball, to be able to read plays and react quickly is really important, because a mistake at safety, if you read it wrong, that's like a 40-yard touchdown, potentially. He has both of those things. He is an incredible athlete. He reads the game really well, whether that's run or pass. He's got a great feel for zone coverage. I also think he's a really good man cover guy. Like Georgia moved him around, which, if you're being the guy who's been moved around Georgia's defense, they're clearly trying to put you in great positions because they know you're the guy, right? And he started at Georgia since his true freshman season. Now,
yeah,
we've seen so many good players come out of that Georgia team, certainly on defense. So if you're starting as a true freshman, that says a lot. He plays in the slot. He can man up against slot receivers. And I like this safety class, but there's not a lot of guys in that class that I'd be like, yep, I'll put you in the slot versus, a proper slot receiver, not a
yeah,
tight end or a flexed out back.
yeah,
He can do it. He's a good run defender. He's a good tackler. Now, the knock on him is going to be size and strength. He's, average size-wise and average strength, which, but, by NFL standards, he's not going to wow anyone. He's not like another guy who I really like, which is South Carolina safety Nicky Menwari, who's
yeah,
like 6'4", 220. He's not that size, but like he's good enough. He's not really been used as a blitzer, right? But I mean, like, if these are the cons that you're finding with a safety, like he doesn't blitz a lot,
yeah.
his size is average, you're kind of like, okay, this guy's pretty good.
Yeah, it feels like you're kind of scraping the barrel to try and find anything to criticize him at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He's a really great. Like I say, I'll be really interested to see where his kind of value comes in, because I think safeties in the first round have a very mixed success rate, certainly. But I think just on a talent perspective,
yeah,
I think he's great.
yeah. I think since Jamal Adams went in the top 8 or whatever it was a few years ago, I think people are a little bit scared about drafting these safeties. You look at Kyle Hamilton falling to 14 a few years ago, annoyingly to my AFC North rivals, the Ravens. Quite an interesting top 5 you've got there. One that I think is maybe not quite with the grain of all of the the kind of generic kind of media, what they've kind of said. Obviously putting Ginchi in there purely as obviously the talent, not based on where you think they're going to go. This wasn't your top 5 mock draft prediction. This is just your top 5 players. So rounded off the top 5 again quickly for me, just to refresh.
Yeah, so number 1, Travis Hunter. Number 2, Mason Graham. Number 3, Ashton Genty. Number 4, Abdul Carter. And number 5, Malachi Starks.
Awesome. So I noticed that you didn't mention any quarterbacks. But obviously, given that the Browns are picking second overall and we desperately need one, the conversation is always going to be about the quarterbacks for the Browns this year. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on this year's class. For me, I don't think any of these quarterbacks are worthy of a top 5 pick. However, I've made it quite clear on this channel that Shedeur Sanders is probably the only one that, how do I say it? I wouldn't be screaming at my TV if they drafted him in the top 5 because I think I would kind of understand it. I do think Cam Ward will, of course, go in the first round, probably in the top 10. I've just not been that keen on him as a prospect for the Browns. Am I stupid for thinking that? How do you view Shedeur and kind of Ward as prospects, and where would you rank them kind of amongst this year's class? Are they 1 and 2?
They're not. No, I will give you my top 5 quarterbacks in a second. What I would say is as an optimistic thing for Browns fans out there. I don't think this class is as bad as 2021, where we obviously had Kenny Pickett, Malik Willis, that kind of thing. I don't think it's that bad. I don't think it's an awful lot better, but I don't think it's that. I don't think we're at that stage here. And I also think the league is definitely going to be higher on the quarterbacks than it is in that class. I don't think we wait till, what was it, pick 17 when Pickett went?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Only first rounder.
Yeah. What I will say, though, is I don't have a single starting grade on any quarterbacks in this class. Now, there are 2 guys that I've kind of earmarked as like developmental starters, but I wouldn't want to start either of them as rookies, and I have questions if they'll ever become NFL starters. My top 5, as it stands now, it is maybe a little different. Is Cam Ward at number 1. I then break a little with the consensus here. I have Jalen Milroe as QB2.
Interesting.
And then I have a gap, and then I have Shedeur Sanders, Will Howard, and then Dylan Gabriel.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this is more of like the Milroe thing is probably going to surprise some people, right? So this is Jalen Milroe, quarterback from Alabama. That might surprise people that I've got him at QB2. I think it's less of an endorsement of Milroe and more of an indictment of the class that he's at 2. Where I'm at with this group is I think when there's no clear guy that I like or that I really think is going to be a slam dunk, I'm going to bet on guys that have traits and trust, if I'm a GM, trust my staff to figure it out. When it comes to Shedeur, I think I can see why people like him because I think he does some of the NFL things really well. Like, he is probably the most accurate quarterback in the class. He is a good processor, the pre-snap awareness, everything like that. Like, he's got that like down, and he's better at those things than Ward and Milroe. My worry with him is he's not the biggest. Like, some of the reported size, obviously he's listed I think 215 pounds, but he's been reported at under 200. Certainly was like last summer he was measured at under 200 pounds, which is like tiny. The tools are average, I'd say. Like, the arm strength is fine. Like, it's okay by NFL standards, but it's not plus. He's an okay athlete, but I think he thinks he's a better athlete than he is with the way he plays.
Yeah.
And I think if he keeps doing that, he'll get into trouble at the NFL. But I don't think, and the reason I've got him at 3 is for a guy who is reliant on his pocket passing to win, I don't think he manages the pocket very well. And that's like a red flag for me. If you're a pocket passer, if you're a guy who doesn't have great kind of athleticism, arm talent, play extension ability, but you struggle when the pocket gets murky, I'm going to be nervous.
Yeah. So, what is it with Cam Ward that you think what makes him the number one guy? I mean, for me, it's not so much. It's not that I'm calling him a bad quarterback. That's not why I've got to the point where I am with the Browns. But for me, it's when I watch him, it just reminds me of. I'll be honest. It reminds me of Deshaun Watson, and we're of course trying to move on from Deshaun Watson, a quarterback that refuses to play in structure, shall we say. Is that just me kind of being scared too much because of Watson? Do you think there's much truth to Cam Ward being one of those kind of outer structure guys, or
That makes me laugh because my comp for Cam Ward is Deshaun Watson.
I thought it might be.
Strictly on-field comp, by the way.
Yeah,
Just get
yeah.
that in there.
Make that clear.
Make that clear. Um, yeah, I can see why if you've gone through the Deshaun Watson experiment, you would be worried about Ward, right? Because he has that same problem as Shador does, which is like, is he gonna play consistently from the pocket? And there's an element as well of I couldn't shake this. And bear in mind, I'm saying this about the guy who is my QB1. So like again, just think about what this means for the draft class. There were
Yeah,
shades of Zach Wilson to his game, and by that I'm like, there are times where he is in a clean pocket and he will just turn his back, bail out, and start to try and create. And the number of times where I'm watching it, you can sometimes see it on broadcast tape, but especially if you kind of get all 22 and you're watching it and you're seeing where these guys are, you're like, you have your receiver open, it's a designed throw to this guy, he's open, and Ward's like, nah, I think I'm going to try and hit a 40-yard bomb rather than take the 7-yard out route. Like, that kind of thing is going to get you killed at the NFL level
yeah,
because you have to take what's there. But if I'm trying to spin the positive, there's an element of his approach which kind of like if I'm looking for upside here, I can see a Jordan Love type outcome. Obviously, I'm a Packers fan, so like I watch a lot of Jordan Love. He will sometimes do kind of crazy things and reckless things, but he's a creative thrower who can create stuff out of nothing, and he'll kind of make you put your head in your hands, but he'll also make you jump out your seat. And there's a bit of that toward. He's got a great arm, and he can make throws from absolutely every angle and platform. He's got better every year he's been in college as well. Like there has been consistent improvement. Let's not forget, like this is a guy who, when he was in high school, he was like playing in a wing T offense, so he never threw the ball. So he's kind of learnt quarterback in college, really. So if you trust your staff, bet on him. Don't start him as a rookie. That's always easier said than done.
yeah,
But I could see with the right staff and the right coaching, I could see him. The ceiling feels higher. And if I'm going for a quarterback, like I'm never gonna play the kind of high floor guy in a draft.
yeah,
Like that's how you get Mac Jones in the first round,
yeah.
right? I'm going to try and shoot for it, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I'd rather take that risk.
Yeah, I'm completely on board with that line of thinking. Why bet on the floor when you can bet on the ceiling? As you said, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But if it does work out, then great for you. As I said, it's the Deshaun Watson stuff for me. It's just so hard to look past the way he plays and kind of put that and imagine that on the Browns right now, a team that is, of course, trying to move away from that kind of style of quarterback. They're trying to go back to, a more West Coast scheme under Kevin Stefanski that they ran before. Is Ward the best fit for that? I think that's what it kind of came down to for me. But in terms of the traits, I mean, I think he's got an elastic arm. He not to do the whole thing, but it is Patrick Mahomes-esque in terms of some of the kind of off-platform throws he can make. Which, as we said, when you're betting on traits, that is something to bet on. But so it's kind of been Cam and Shador. Obviously, the media have viewed them as the top two guys. They are probably the two guys that most Browns fans are thinking about in regards to number two. as I said, I've not really been interested in entertaining the idea of drafting a quarterback at number 2 for most of this process. But I think with the Miles news and the potential that the Browns could be entering a rebuild, I've kind of warmed on it a little bit, because if you are going to enter a rebuild, why not do it with your guy at quarterback? So I can kind of understand that. But as I said, I've essentially held the position all off-season that I think the Browns should get a veteran free agent to start for 2025 and then draft one of these guys day 2. Jalen Milroe was, it's funny, I'm really happy that you kind of had him at number 2, actually, because he's kind of been the guy that I've been fixated on as a day 2 prospect in, maybe with the pick 33, or if we get a trade back, maybe we can get him a little bit later in the second. But so you kind of touched on Jalen Milroe there, but Will Howard and Jackson Dart, I think, are the other 2 guys, and Dylan Gabriel, that kind of draw the attention for me. How would you rank? Obviously, we know you've got Jalen Milroe above them, but how would you rank kind of those day 2 prospects?
So I've got a fairly big gap between Milroe and the other guys we mentioned.
Yeah.
Just because of the tools, and like at the very least, you're getting a high level athlete at quarterback with a great arm. There's room to grow, but like the flashes are there. Like if you watch the Georgia game, the Vanderbilt game, like they're some of the best tape you'll watch this year. But then you'll watch other games like the Michigan game, and it's just like head in hands stuff. I like Will Howard. I think there's stuff there to like, as a kind of, the question there is, it's maybe like the Shador thing, but maybe like of a slightly lower tier of, is it a high level backup you're getting, or is it a starter? I think Howard's going to be one of those guys who plays in the league for a long time.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether he'll ever be a kind of starter. I have Gabriel as QB5, as I mentioned. Now, like, he's tiny. I'm just trying to see what he measured in at the Senior Bowl here. He measured in at 5'10", 202. So we're talking like Bryce Young size.
Yeah.
Now, Bryce Young's been pretty good this year, like towards the back end. So like, it's not. I'm not saying he can't succeed, but like the tools there. He's a good athlete, but the arm isn't great. It's kind of like Bryce Young, but probably slightly worse.
Yeah.
Again, feels like a backup. Jackson Dart, he seems to be the guy who's getting a lot of love now, and like he seems to be quote unquote a riser in like media circles.
Yeah.
I don't see it myself. I don't understand where it's coming from. I think I have him. He might be QB, from memory, QB9 for me.
Oh wow.
I think, like, it's the Ole Miss offense is a big part of it, right? Like that offense is not an NFL offense. This is the same. It's not the same offense, but it's a similar type of thing to where we saw Hendon Hooker coming out of Tennessee, Matt Corral, obviously when he came out of Ole Miss. These aren't offenses that ask. They run a ton of RPOs. They run a ton of like screens. They're single, or half field reads at most. It's not stuff that you'll be running on an NFL field. Certainly not as like your primary thing. You'll mix them in, but they're not going to be at the same rate.
Yeah.
When you watch him have to do proper drop back concepts and read concepts out, the results aren't great. The stats look great, but I think that's because it's boosted by the scheme. As we've seen guys do this, whether it's running back, wide receiver, quarterback, this scheme is great for college production, but I don't think it produces great NFL talent. And I think the tools are kind of okay, but I don't see a guy that I'm like, well, I'll get him in my scheme because he's got great tools and we'll kind of develop him. I think he's fine, but I've seen like people talking about him as a first rounder, and like I may be wrong. Like the NFL, when they get desperate for quarterbacks, they throw him into the first round, but I don't get it.
I mean, you mentioned the 2021 NFL draft earlier. We saw Malik Willis getting mocked in the top 5 that year, all of this kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of how much of it is that just basically overvaluing the quarterbacks that come into these mock drafts. But I think finally on the quarterbacks, what I just want to kind of get your thoughts on. So with Jalen Milroe, as I said, that's kind of been where I'm at. If he's available there in the second, I'd probably do it. Do you think there's any chance that he goes in the first round?
I don't. If I were putting money on it, I don't think he does. But it may be one of those situations where there's a team at the top of the second that thinks they want to get the fifth year option and they trade into the back end of the first
Yeah,
round. He feels more like he'll go in the kind of Jalen Hurts range, which I mean I've heard Jalen Hurts type comps for him. They're slightly different, I think. I mean I
yeah.
think Miller is a better athlete,
I don't
but
think he's quite the thrower that Jalen Hurts was in college.
yeah, yeah. But in terms of their size and their kind of certainly from what like if you listen to the guys who are really plugged in, like their work ethic, their kind of competitive toughness, very similar. Um, yeah, I think they should be able to get him at 33, but as I say, the NFL sometimes all it takes is one team, right? All it takes
Yeah,
is one team to love a guy, and then they go first round.
yeah,
Um, so you never know. There's some mad teams out there that might get desperate. Owners that are, desperate. Head coaches and GMs that are on hot seats that think I'll take a quarterback and buy a
yeah.
bit more time. Um, so I'd like to think Cleveland should get him though if they wanted him without having to trade up into the first.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the trade up. Of course, the Browns have a possibility maybe to trade back from two. They have all the Miles stuff going on. Maybe I very much doubt it, but if they did trade him before the draft, that's a whole lot more picks to go to the already existing 11 picks they have. So I think they could be in you know, a possibility that they could maybe trade back up into the first round for him if they feel like he won't make it to them at 33, or if they just want that fifth year option. I'm not sure if you know this, but Tommy Rees, the offensive coordinator that we've
Yes.
obviously promoted this year, was his offensive coordinator at Alabama in 2023. So there's of course going to be everyone kind of drawing the links between it there, but that's kind of been where I've been at with the quarterbacks. It's been, I don't really see any of these guys as top prospects. Don't see any of these guys being worthy of the second overall pick. So for me, it's been, let's sign a veteran and draft Jalen Milroe in the second round. So I'm pleased, to say the least, to see that you've got him higher than obviously some people do in this kind of process. But with that being said about the quarterbacks, obviously not being exactly a strength of this draft, what position groups kind of as a whole do you see as the strengths of this draft? And then obviously which ones would you see as the weaknesses as well?
Yeah, I'd say biggest strengths for me are probably running back, safety. We're definitely not getting the sexy positions here, and defensive line. And
Yeah,
with that, I'd include interior defensive line and edge. Um, I think the reason I like these three is because they all have studs at the top, at least one. Some of them have more than one. I think I mentioned South Carolina safety, Nicky Manwari earlier. I think he's brilliant. I think he's going to go higher than people think. Running back, I'm a big Trayvon Henderson fan, but there's also like a bunch of other guys there that are really good. Um, Defensive line, we've talked Mason Graham,
yeah,
Walton Nolan is great. I like Derek Harmon from Oregon. That's obviously on the interior. Edge, we've mentioned Abdul Carter. Then there's a bunch of other guys. I'm a massive Shamar Stewart from
yeah,
Texas A&M fan.
yeah,
Um, those feel to me like the best ones because they've got those guys, but there's also depth. Like there's guys I'm looking at all those positions on day two. Certainly running back. I mean, you're
yeah,
talking like there's probably good running backs into day three. I mean, there always is, but like this year particularly,
yeah,
there's guys I'm looking at thinking they'll probably be down top around four, and I think they could be maybe not like a bell cow, but a good part of an NFL backfield.
yeah,
So having that blend of kind of talent at the top, but depth, I think all of those ones tick that box.
yeah. You see, that's music to my ears as a Browns fan. We need a running back pretty urgently. It's been quite a hard pill to swallow, of course, with the Nick Chubb stuff. I know some Browns fans out there are still kind of clinging on to the idea that maybe he can return to his former self. I'm doubtful. I think the Browns need to really invest into their run game this year. And as you mentioned, the running back prospects this year seem to be pretty deep. I've got my eyes on Caleb Johnson out of Iowa. I just think he would fit the Browns. I mentioned earlier about what they're trying to do, more of that West Coast zone blocking scheme. I just think he'll really fit in well with us. But as you said, I think there's, whether they decide to go early day two or even later day two and potentially even day three, I think there's studs to be found in this running back class, which of course is massive for the Browns. Defensive line and safety as well. I've probably got defensive line as the Browns' number one need on defense, purely just rotational bodies they need to bring in there, and of course with Miles, if he's going to be going, they need to kind of rebolster that defensive line, and then safety as well. I'm fed up of the Browns trying to do the whole free agent avenue for safeties. They tried it with John Johnson, they tried it with Juan Thornhill. I don't expect him to be back the next year at all. So I'm kind of in the camp of let's just draft one of these guys, develop them, and hopefully they can become the long-term starter at that safety position. So that is, of course, good to hear as a Browns fan. What about the offensive line? Where would you kind of include that into this?
So I ummed and ahed about where the offensive line sits, right? Because um, I think there's quite a lot of talent, but more than any other year, this feels like one where there's so many of the guys that we're talking about where they fit best. Are they a tackle? Are they a guard?
Yeah,
You know, there's so much of that. If you're the kind of team who just goes, I need offensive line help, there's plenty of guys. If I was a team that was saying, oh, I need my franchise left tackle, there's guys I like, but I don't think it's necessarily as strong as some other years have been. I think for me, the best offensive lineman in the class is LSU's Will Campbell. He obviously played left tackle in college. I think he's a guard in the NFL.
yeah,
I think he can play tackle, and I'd probably give him a shot at tackle. I think his best football is at guard. He struggled a bit in space, and he has some length question marks. I just think, but also he's insanely. He's the kind of nasty, proper hard nosed offensive lineman you want on
yeah,
the interior.
a
So I
mover.
like that kind of attitude on the interior.
Yeah,
I'm a big Tyler Booker fan, who's the guard from Alabama.
yeah,
I think he's gonna. I saw that Daniel Jeremiah had him top 10 in his mock draft, which was reassuring because I've had him graded a true first round grade since I watched him, and I'm
yeah.
am I missing something here? Because I don't think that many people seem to be talking him up. But outside of that, there's some real weaknesses. I think there's the center class is not great. There's guys who are maybe going to be converted to center, but again, you're guessing a bit there as to what they'll be. Yeah, there's not a lot of. It feels like a mixed up class. If I need talent, great, but if I need a specific role filling,
Yeah.
I'm maybe not feeling as good.
And is that talent kind of widespread? Do you think is it similar to the running backs where you could probably get a maybe potential future starter in late day two, day three, or do you think it's kind of top heavy the talent in the offensive line?
I think certainly on the interior, there's guys on day two that you'll be able to kind of that will be good starters. I think there's a few guys who showed out at the Senior Bowl who may now have raised their stock that kind of maybe I thought would be borderline top 50 who are maybe going to rise up a little bit now. But yeah, I mean there are guys I like further down the board. NC State offensive tackle Anthony Belton is a
Yeah,
man mountain who was really good at Senior Bowl. Um, he'll probably go, I don't know, maybe third or fourth round. I think there's something there. But offensive tackle, you're generally if there are the top ones, and if we're talking true offensive tackles, there's a few that are, I think, good bets to go first round, but they always go early. Unless you're Green Bay, finding a starting offensive tackle
yeah.
on in the later rounds is tricky.
Yeah, I mean we've tried it in the first round, obviously with Jed Wills. 2020 looked like that might be a great pick. Now,
Mm,
not so much.
yeah.
Due to become a free agent, I would be shocked if they brought him back. DeJuan Jones obviously was a revelation as a rookie. Took a slight step back last year. How much of that was influenced by the injury, I'm not so sure. But I think I think it's good because I'm in the boat that the Browns need to revamp the whole offensive line. As I mentioned, 2020 was historic. That unit, they were incredible. But I think because of that, the last few years, people that maybe aren't as kind of clued in with the Browns kind of just go, yeah, that offensive line is great. It's not. It's not at all. There's been
Mm,
cracks in this offensive line, in my opinion, since 2020. And it's just kind of getting old now. You look at the interior, Wyatt and Joel. Joel might retire. Wyatt's getting pretty old and expensive, and obviously I mentioned about the tackles. The only one position they do have is a centre, so thankfully, thankfully that's how you described it. But so I think that could be a positive for the Browns in terms of, I think they kind of need to get multiple guys in this draft. As I mentioned earlier, they've got 11 picks. That might even increase. So obviously a complete revamp on the offensive line would be needed. So, but obviously with them not being the top guys, they're never going to draft one at two. So
no.
it's always about who's going to be there day two for me. And as you kind of mentioned, maybe there is some guys that they could get in there day two that could fill that role, which is of course good to know. So finally on positionals, kind of ranking, what would you say are the weakest position other than quarterback, as we mentioned? What would you say are the weakest?
Yeah, quarterback is obviously the one. Yeah, center isn't great. I think that I wouldn't say this is a weak one, but it's maybe worth just kind of touching on here. Cornerback is a weird one,
Yeah,
right? I'm not sure I'd say it's a weakness, but it's so there's a bunch of guys that are really talented and have great tape, but they almost all of them have like some fairly substantial injury question marks. So Will Johnson from Michigan, Savon Ravel from East Carolina, and Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame. Their tape is brilliant. If you watch any of their tape, you'll be like, "Oh, this guy's great. Like this guy should go high." And they've all had injuries. Morrison in particular has had shoulder surgery and he's had hip surgery, which for a cornerback really worries me. Now, obviously, for the Browns, there's not much of a need for cornerbacks, so this will be another sigh of relief moment. But it's just an odd one. Like, it feels like it could be the kind of class where there's a bunch of guys that, actually all end up being great, but it could be the kind of one where some of these names really fall in the draft, and it kind of doesn't end up being what people maybe thought it would be if you go
yeah,
back 6 months, where I think this cornerback class would, if you'd asked in the summer, cornerback felt like it was definitely one of the biggest strengths, but
yeah,
it doesn't seem to have materialised.
yeah. I mean, there's been some rumblings about Denzel Ward potentially also wanting out if Miles leaves, which of course would be a massive loss for the Browns. This might be the last year with Greg Newsome. I can't see them, going too expensive with that extension. So, but that's kind of where I come back to Travis Hunter, I think, because that's the kind of luxury on that, isn't it? That you can have that player that you can play at wide receiver, and then down the line, if you do need a slot corner or you do need someone to kind of fill that role on the outside, then he can go and do it.
Yeah.
Finally, on positions, wide receiver is one that has been puzzling me quite a lot. Everything I try and kind of find out about these guys, I hear that the top end is quite thin compared to, let's say, the last few years with some of just the incredible prospects we've had coming into the NFL at the wide receiver position, what feels like a decade now. But then on the kind of flip side of it, everyone's telling me that the depth is really good in this wide receiver class. So I don't really know where to lie on it. But it's a position definitely in need for the Browns. They've of course got Jerry Jeudy, who unbelievable breakout year last year. I've got faith in him as their wide receiver one. But outside of that, I mean, I think there's only one other guy they've got rostered next year that's had more than 12 receptions in the NFL. So they're going to have to bring in experience, but they're of course also going to have to draft a guy just for bodies. And this Browns regime loves drafting day three wide receivers. So, what's your kind of thoughts on this wide receiver class as a whole? Does that make any sense? Kind of what I've said, or do you think it's different to that?
Yeah, no, it does. I've just finished doing my kind of final wide receiver film grades this year, so I've got through 20 guys so far. There'll probably be a few more I kind of add on. I think there's depth in the class. I think it's one of those where like I wouldn't class wide receiver as a strength or a weakness of the class. It just feels kind of solid. Um, Travis Hunter's my wide receiver one. Um, you've got two other guys in the class who I think can be the kind of, you know, the guy you build your passing game around potentially. In Luther Burden, who's my wide receiver two from
Yep.
Missouri, and Ted McMillan from Arizona, who I have as wide receiver three,
Yep.
who seems to probably be the consensus wide receiver one in the class at the moment. Now, I like those guys. I think if you go back last year, I don't think any of them are going ahead of Malik Neighbours. There's maybe a conversation to be had when you get to like the Romadunze type guys, but yeah, it doesn't feel like there's a guy you go, oh, he is going to be like, you know, all pro receiver. Travis Hunter would be my bet, and I do
Yeah.
think he's great, and I think he's got that potential. But there's still room for growth as a receiver. Um, the good thing for the Browns is if you need a really good wide receiver too, um, there's quite a few guys I think are really good. Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. Obviously, you're an Ohio State fan, so you'll
Yeah.
know how good he is. He's like the safest wide
Yeah.
receiver in the class. Good athlete, great route runner, good hands. I don't. I have some questions if he's ever going to be like a 100 target guy in the NFL. But like, if you have him as your wide receiver two, you're doing like incredible. I think he
Yeah.
could be a wide receiver one in a pinch, but like, I think he's like a high level wide receiver two for me. Um, a few other guys I like Jack Besh from TCU,
Yep.
Elekai Mana from Stanford, Matthew Golden from Texas has been getting a lot of love. I don't quite see the first round hype that he's been getting from some,
Yep.
but like if the Browns maybe decided with that pick at 33 they wanted to go for a receiver, I think there's real value there. Third round, there's probably still some guys that are good. And there's a few really good athletes. The one guy, if I'm picking like a really intriguing prospect, is Isaiah Bond from Texas because he is one of the best athletes in the class. I say one of. There's a Arian Smith from Georgia is like, you know, almost like professional level track speed. But like
Yeah.
other than him, Hunter is lightning quick, really great stop start ability, really good yak threat, good hands, better route runner than he's given credit for. But like it never really materialized in college. He dealt with injuries at Texas. Like there's you if you told me in 5 years' time that Isaiah Bond was like a high level NFL wide receiver, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah.
But if you told me he like never materialized into anything, I also wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So like he could be, if you're looking like round 2 or 3, I don't know where he'll go, probably round 2. He could be an intriguing one, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, as I mentioned, there's not quite the Malik Neighbours or the Marvin Harrison Juniors or the Jamar Chases coming out this year, but that doesn't mean there's not value to be found. Interesting that you've got Tet as your third guy. I've seen a lot of people. I think just because of maybe how this draft is, but him getting mocked in the top 10 does seem a bit of a stretch to me. But I think it's more the traits, isn't it? The size, kind of what he offers. Kind of that unicorn-esque kind of physical profile at the wide receiver position. Amita Ibuka is an interesting one, and I think wide receiver two is a great. I mean, he was a wide receiver two in college. This isn't a guy that
Yeah.
is going to be coming in as a wide receiver one and is going to be going, "Whoa, what's going on here? Where's my 100 targets?" He's used to it. He's played with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Jeremiah Smith, two of the, in my opinion, best wide receiver prospects I've ever seen. So for him to play behind them and be successful, he is Ohio State's all-time leading receptions leader. So just a really solid prospect for me. Do you think he goes in the first, or do you think he slips into the second?
I wouldn't be surprised if it was somewhere kind of back end of the first round. Like I said, it's a kind of thinner class maybe at the top, so it might bump some of those second tier guys up a little bit. But I think he'll be somewhere in that kind of 20 to 40 range for me.
Yeah,
I don't see him going any higher.
yeah.
But I could be wrong.
So overall, positional strengths this year, I think you kind of on the same as me here. Running back, defensive line, safety. You can maybe argue DB as a whole, but as you kind of mentioned, the corner class has kind of maybe fallen a little bit. And then obviously the biggest weakness is quarterback. I think stands out the most. And then, as we kind of said, it's not so much that the wide receiver position and maybe some of these other positions aren't necessarily weaknesses, but it's just a bit thinner at the top compared to some of the other positions. As you mentioned with D line and running back, it's not just that it's the depth, but it's also the top guys at the top as well, which kind of promote them up. But I don't want to keep too much of your time, but I do just want to, if we can, do a quick little Senior Bowl little recap. Something that I had my eyes on, obviously, during the week, as I love the Senior Bowl anyway. I just think it's an awesome event down in Mobile. It gives so much opportunity to guys that maybe might not have had the opportunity to go and display some of the stuff that the top guys do at the combine. As you probably guessed with my Jalen Milroe conversation earlier, he was the guy that I was kind of looking at the most in Mobile. But he seemed to struggle, I think, from the reports and potentially hurt his draft stock. But I think he's going to go to Indy at the combine and, he's probably going to run the fastest 40 time out of any quarterback, something that is always going to get, the media buzz and media attentions. But what's your kind of thoughts on how he got on overall at the Senior Bowl?
I think the Senior Bowl is always odd for quarterbacks because so much of what you're doing there is chemistry related. Like, those throwing to receivers you've never thrown to before.
Yeah,
It's hard to look good. That being said, I do think Milroe struggled. Like the problem with Milroe, the biggest problem with his game is his accuracy, and it's generally like a mechanical thing. Like I think it's fixable, um, but when you're doing those kind of one-on-ones, receiver versus DB, and you're just kind of sailing the ball, um, it's tough because
yeah,
it's not like you've got pressure in your face. It's not you can't. It's just like routes on air. Um, I thought there were flashes from him, but yeah, I don't think it was a great. I don't think it was a great week. I don't think it was a great week for any of the QBs really. Tyler Shuck from Louisville
yeah,
looked pretty decent. And then there's a guy who I will confess I have never watched before I was going through Senior Bowl tape. Taylor Elgersma who's from Canada.
yeah.
Um, he had some nice throws, but it's it's always a tough one for QBs to succeed in. I think.
Yeah, I mean, how often do we hear about any quarterback kind of going to the Senior Bowl and lighting it up? Maybe that they would at the combine. I think, as you said, it's a hard kind of environment for them to do so. I think it's more designed for the wide receivers and cornerbacks, especially in the day and age now of 7v7. These guys have been doing this kind of stuff pretty much since they were kids. Whereas with the quarterbacks, as you said, you're turning up to throw routes on air with guys that you've never thrown to before. So it's always going to be tough. Which positions and as a whole, I suppose, and maybe if you have a few players as examples as well, stood out for you the most? I think most of the reporting that came out was this defensive line, but maybe that is what you will say, which is absolutely fine. But other than that as well, what other positions do you think stood out the most?
Yeah, I think one of the things with the Senior Bowl that is always important to remember is that those one-on-ones, which are kind of, I suppose, the main parts of it, certainly for me, they are geared towards success for one side rather than the other. Like
Yeah,
the one-on-ones is, in the trenches, the D line have an advantage. The one-on-ones, in terms of coverage, the receiver, tight end, running back has an advantage because you've got the whole field to work with. That being said, I think if I was to pick out one guy who I thought looked really good, there was some great offensive line play. Um, I thought Gray Zabel, Gray Zabel played tackle at North Dakota State, and he is probably going to be, well, I think he is going to be an interior player at the next level, whether that's guard or centre. Um, he played centre in high school, I believe, so it's not kind of entirely new territory for him. But he was used on the interior in Mobile, and I thought he looked brilliant. Like, he looked like a natural. It's always the thing with these guys where you think they might change position, so seeing them at the Senior Bowl, how they actually fare, is always important, especially for offensive line, because, like I say, those drills are weighted against you. Those guys have two-way goes. You're out on an island. Like, it's really not fair on you. So if you're an offensive lineman and you succeed, I think like that's noteworthy. The other
Yeah,
guy who I thought looked really good, which might surprise some people if they've seen that particular rep, is Josh Connolly, the Oregon offensive tackle. Now there's one rep where he goes up against Mike Green
yeah,
from Marshall,
yeah.
and Mike Green just like bulldozes him.
But I think he
Um,
was doing that against most of the tackles
he
down there,
yeah.
wasn't he?
So Green did that against everybody. He
Yeah,
had an incredible week. On that rep, Connolly was playing right tackle. He's a left tackle
yeah,
normally, and so like there was an element of the unfamiliar. But like outside of that one rep, which everybody, including me, shared on Twitter, he was really good. So those guys were great. The one other guy that I would mention alongside like Mike Green, whose film I haven't watched but is now on my list to watch, is Darius Alexander, the defensive tackle from Toledo. Um, I feel like every year we see a guy from like a group of five school come to the Senior Bowl and just like show out, and everyone's like, "Who is this guy? Like, where's this come from? I need to go back and revisit the tape." He was that guy this year, like consistently disruptive in the one-on-ones, kind of good athlete, multiple ways to win. Definitely a player who I think is going to start rising up boards. And I think I saw Jordan Reed from ESPN. I think it was Jordan Reed had Alexander in his top 50. So he was great. And Walter Nolan from Old Miss, I'll give a shout out to Nolan because he's a player I really like. I
yeah,
thought he had a really good week, and I think he's kind of solidified himself as a first rounder.
yeah. And I think that's, as I mentioned, that's what I kind of love about the Senior Bowl is that, as you said, you can have these guys that turn up from the Mountain West Conference, any even D2 guys in certain occasions, and they can come up and really make a name for themselves and really help their draft stock. And it's just awesome to see those kind of stories. It's kind of why I love the Senior Bowl as a whole. So good to see all of that stuff. But finally, on the Senior Bowl, seeing as we joked about it over the messages, um, what day three wide receiver prospect stood out the most?
Um, so I quite liked Iowa State's Jalen Noel.
Yeah,
I thought he had a really nice week. He's kind of a little undersized, but he's quick. He's a good route runner. He's the kind of guy who's like built to thrive at the Senior Bowl. Um, Jalen Royals, another Jalen but spelled different. Jalen
yeah,
Royals from Utah State had another good week. He was again kind of cutting up the one-on-ones, playing really well. I think he's going to be a really solid NFL receiver, a really good yak threat, but also a good route runner, separates well. Jack Besh, now this is a guy from TCU. Now I don't know if he's going to be day three. I have him as a firmly day two, top of day two prospect, but he had a great week. And I've got to give some love to Tez Johnson from
yeah,
Oregon.
yeah,
Like Tez Johnson, like he's the kind of guy that is built to succeed in those one-on-ones because he's like super shifty, super quick. Um, he does weigh, I think it's 155 pounds.
yeah. I was reading
Like
this
so, he
yesterday.
is
Yeah,
he is tiny, and he plays like it. Like if you get your hands on him, he's done. You'll hear Tank Dell comps with him.
yeah,
I don't think he's Tank Dell, and I don't think he goes that high.
yeah.
Um, but there's shades of it there. I thought he's phenomenal, and he's a really fun player. He's one of those guys that you'll watch and you'll be like, okay, there's question marks about how he translates, but man, he's just fun. Like put
Yeah,
on the Oregon Penn State game,
yeah.
watch that, and you'll be like, you'll fall in love with him.
And I think as well, it's easy to root for the guys that look more like us. When I think I weigh more than him, which is saying something. I'm not exactly the biggest guy, and I think I weigh more than him. But it's always it's like the Steph Curry thing in the NBA, isn't it? When you see a guy that you can actually look at and think, wow, if we stood next to each other, we wouldn't look that far apart, and you're dominating, in the 1v1s down in the Senior Bowl. So it's always awesome to see. But finally, before I do let you go, I've just got one last question. It's, of course, the biggest question of the Browns off-season. What do you think the Browns should do with the number 2 pick in this year's draft?
So I think the priority is try and trade down.
Yeah,
It's not going to be the most exciting or sexy pick
yeah,
thing to do, but like with the way it's going and with the Myles Garrett news, the team's heading for a rebuild, and I think, as we've already discussed, there's a need for a quarterback. I think we both agree like trying to force one here at number 2 is a silly idea because you're
yeah,
just going to put yourself in a bad spot. The 2026 class, who knows what it will be like, but it certainly looks at the moment like it'll be better than this.
yeah,
I'd try and just stock up on picks for next year. There's 11 picks that they've got this year. I don't think you need more this year. Stock up on 2026 picks and kind of hope that you can get a quarterback next year. Now,
yeah,
it obviously takes 2 to tango, right? But we've talked about, I think specifically Abdul Carter and Travis Hunter.
yeah,
I think they're prospects that teams may want to trade up for. And there may be a team that is desperate enough for a quarterback. The Giants may, if the Titans don't take a quarterback, the
yeah,
Giants may want to move up. The Raiders maybe. If you get a trade partner and the compensation is right, that for me feels like the move
yeah,
you've got to make.
yeah. And so that is where I've been at with this as well. I've been kind of team trade back. For me, if it's the Giants at 3 and you can just swap picks and get an extra second, maybe it's something for next year as well. That is kind of what I think I would do just to get those 2 extra seconds, because how much I want a running back and quarterback in the second round. But of course, the Raiders is another team I'm looking at. They've just brought in a new coach. If they're looking to come up for that quarterback, that and for next year's first, that's the route I would take. But if they were forced, as you said, it takes 2 to tango. They might not find a partner. If they are forced to just stick there at 2, is it Travis Hunter for you if he's there?
I think if Carter's gone at 1, I'd take Hunter. If they're both on the board, if the Titans take a quarterback, as much as Hunter is a higher rated player for me, I'd go Carter, just given
Yeah,
where the Browns are. I think if we're basing this on the fact that they're going to lose Garrett, like you look at that edge group and it's thin. I mean,
yeah,
it's thin with Garrett. It feels like. I mean, he is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. At least from my perspective. But if he's gone, like there's you need that guy that you can build around.
yeah,
And you need a franchise cornerstone because you don't have the quarterback.
yeah,
For fans as well, right? Like you've got some great players, like Denzel Ward's brilliant, but you need that guy that fans can root for
yeah,
and be the guy that helps you kind of lead you into a better era.
yeah.
So someone like Carter just feels like he could be that guy if Garrett's gone.
Yeah, he's been the guy for me pretty much the whole process. I can promise to anyone listening, I have not paid Jack anything to come on here and say that it's Carter. I promise I have not. But he's been the guy for me. If they are forced to stick at 2, I think that's what I'm going to do. And I think that's what I was going to do regardless of the Miles situation. You mentioned the Browns defense. There's some good rotational pieces, but as you said, if Miles goes, they need that number 1 guy on that defensive line to command attention, because as good as the other rotational pieces are, they're not going to be that good if they're getting a lot more attention, because obviously they lose Miles. But brilliant stuff. Thank you so much for coming on, Jack. I really do appreciate it. Amazing insight there, stuff that I couldn't even find online. So awesome stuff. Before you go, just let everyone know where they can find you, your social medias, as well as obviously the touchdown and stuff like that.
Yeah, best place to find me is on Twitter or whatever we're calling it these days. Handle is there. It's Jack _Brentnall. So, the next couple of months are going to be full of NFL draft stuff. So I'll be popping film threads,
Yep.
articles, all sorts of stuff, and we'll be doing a draft guide. So keep your eyes peeled for whenever that drops.
Yep, and I'll link all the links to Jack's socials as well as his websites in the description for this interview. And Jack, I hope to have you on maybe one more time before the draft. We'll see how it gets to there with the Browns. Maybe we've traded Miles by then. But as for now, again, thank you so much for coming on. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the Super Bowl as much as you can.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me.